Welcome to This is What Democracy Sounds Like. I'm Kevin Prang. This program is a presentation of Metropolitan Congregations United. MCU is a community organization that brings together religious congregations, community groups, and individuals to work for a common purpose to create a better life for all residents of the St. Louis region. We work at the intersection of race, economy, political power, gender, and the structures of oppression at work within us individually, within our organization, and within the community. We are working towards building people's control of the government, building community control of the economy, expanding the public sphere, and creating structural racial equity. Today, my guests are Emmaline Giles, environmental justice organizer at MCU, and Leah Clyburn, Beyond Coal organizer for the Sierra Club Missouri chapter. Today, we'll be talking about environmental justice, what it is, and how MCU and the Sierra Club are working with St. Louis communities. Welcome, Emmaline and Leah. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you. Always a pleasure.
Emmaline, to start off, describe your mission as the environmental justice organizer at MCU.
Yeah, so along with the mission of MCU in general, I'm working specifically to help mobilize and organize Black clergy and their congregation members around environmental issues that are most impacting them in their communities. And I'm working right now specifically in areas of Jennings and the 27th Ward, trying to build relationships, building a base of folks.
Okay, Leah, tell us about the Sierra Club's mission and then what your role is with Beyond Coal.
Within the Sierra Club, the Beyond Coal is mainly focused, the campaign is focused on educating communities all across the United States around the importance for us to transition to renewable energy resources like wind and solar, and truly reduce our carbon imprint across the United States, across the world, right? Because if people haven't noticed, climate change is something, right? So with doing that, we've been really using the framework of what we call the Jemez Principals, which is lifts up the voices and concerns and the values of community members that are highly impacted during this time. So I'm truly blessed and honored to be able to work with so many grassroots organizations all across Missouri that really highlight the impacts of the unjust laws and policies that have been either ignored or have been not even enforced, right, all across Missouri in order to, unfortunately, allow profit to prevail over people.
And that takes us to sort of the overview of what we want to talk about today, which is environmental justice. Can both of you tell me for yourselves, what does environmental justice mean? What is this definition, and how is it different than just environmentalism?
I really see environmental justice as a movement, not just an area of study or anything. It's really a movement, and it first and foremost is led by people of color. And it demands that people of color, wherever we work, live, and play, we have the rights to a clean and healthy environment wherever we are. And typically, people of color, especially low-income communities, are most disproportionately impacted by environmental racism. And that can be anywhere from mold in our homes, lead poisoning in our paints, things of that nature. And what really sets that apart from environmentalism, for decades, environmentalism has really been led by white folks, and it's been around conservation and clean waters and things like that, which is really important, but it's not the entire environment. It is not taking consideration where we live, work, and play, and how there are like tangible environmental toxic polluters that are specifically oriented around people of color.
You nailed it. I think to really hit it home is that, so when we're talking about conservation, right, we're looking to conserve, right, what already exists. But if there's policies and laws that are allowing for what exists to then be taken away, then what are we fighting for? right? And so, and to go just deeper into that, a lot of times what we're finding is when we look at like the laws around how our utilities and what resources that they use, right, in order to provide us with power, to provide us with resources, what is the effect from that, right? That's what we're calling out. That's what environmental justice is about, is while we utilize resources, how is this affecting our neighbors over here, right? How is it going to affect our future, right? Our waterways, right? Our conservation areas, right? And so often we overlook those things. And so these are laws that the environmental justice reviews and focuses on laws that are either missing or not enforced effectively in the misuse of resources, right? When we're talking about land, wind, air, and water, right? And how this is impacting the least of us, right? So it's sometimes so easy for folks to look at, Black and brown communities. Now, granted, especially in Missouri, that is definitely a place, right? But it's also our private owned farms that are out in rural Mo, right? It's always interesting. The people on the two far ends of the spectrum here in Missouri are the ones that are highly impacted, and the rest of us, we're still impacted, but we don't see it, right? It's just not prevalent, right? And it doesn't really hit our pockets like the way it does for folks like what Emmaline was talking about with the mold, right? Most of us would live and have the opportunity to hold folks accountable for poor living environments, but mold is an issue. Mold is a part of the environment in which we live in, and when it sets in these low-income homes that are being, pushed off on our lower income folks, or even our immigrant refugee community members, that's a problem, right? All the way to, like, say, our folks over in rural Missouri, where they're dealing with high levels of lead in their water, right? They're looking at land being snatched from them, right? Just to appease a corporation who prides itself on being a partner of our community. Instead, they are actually being a hindrance.
So it sounds like there's also a little bit of a class division in there too, that the environmentalism of the past is something that we sort of associate with suburban life, if you will. The recycling, making sure the parks look good, things along those lines. Leah, what you're talking about is taking a look at how poverty infects that living environment also. And then Emmaline, your point is that is also overlaid with the racial injustice that affects both of those issues.
Absolutely. And I also wanted to lift up that, and welcome folks to look into, there's lots of information online about the environmental justice movement, how, we've had ancestors, of course, and indigenous ancestors before us who have fought for these same things too. Though a lot of folks, when we think of the environmental justice movement in the US, point back to 1982, where Warren County in North Carolina really fought in a way that set the stage for an environmental justice movement in the US. And I always want to lift that up as folks can look into that and learn about it and see how it led to the work that we're doing now. Even in 1991, there was the first People's Summit for environmental justice. And that was all led by people of color. And if I didn't mention it before, environmental justice is a movement inherently moved and led by people of color, right?
And that's so true. And even go further, it happened here in Missouri with the Rainbow Coalition, right? Along with MRCC, the Missouri Rural Crisis Center, along with strong partnership with the Organization for Black Struggle. Right. The two of them who are still existent today. Right. Mama Jamala and Miss Rhonda, they work together to fight for the preservation of these farmlands, of land. right? Because land was not just being snatched from Black farmers that lived in North County. Land was being snatched from folks who lived in rural Missouri. And so that's exactly what it happens, right? If we even look at the history of division, right, in our country, it first started off due to classism and then was justified due to racism, right? And it's all these isms that continues to play a huge role in the depletion of our resources. And so we're saying with environmental racism, with lifting this up, environmental justice and demanding environmental justice for all people is actually a human rights issue, right? So we're demanding support for all people in lines with their human rights, right? And along dividing folks based off of the color of their skin or the horrible narrative of, oh, well, they could do better if they didn't. And another, prime example of how this is so intentional is if people look up, it's actually online, the Team 4, right? How St. Louis was structured to galvanize resources from everywhere around the Central Corridor. And just for those who aren't clear what the Central Corridor is, that's the Central West End. You want to find all the mansions or, the movie, Meet Me in St. Louis, all of that, Forest Park, all that area, right? But who lives there?
So let's turn a little bit to what you guys have been up to these days. Now, the outbreak of COVID-19 has put a halt to a lot of normal work and face-to-face organizing. So how has the pandemic changed what you do and refocused how you're working with communities?
It really made us have to transition a lot of the work that we set out to do originally. We're still working around a lot of that work, which is specifically energy efficiency, that was one of the things we wanted to engage clergy leaders and their members around, trying to connect resources and funding to improve their energy efficiency, even through LED lightings, things like that. And then the pandemic, when it hit, it shook all of us. It really halted a lot of congregations and their ministries, their services. Everyone was having to figure out how to transition onto virtual services. We had to figure out what virtual organizing was, and at the same time take care of ourselves and our well-beings. So one of the ways that we've actually transitioned in our environmental justice work, and Leah's a big partner of mine in this work too, is we started to plug in our own communities around this movement of mutual aid. So in St. Louis, we have St. Louis Mutual Aid Network, and there's mutual aid networks all across the nation. They existed before the pandemic, but when the pandemic hit, it ballooned basically all over, and it's now in every major metropolitan city. And it's neighbors and community residents coming together to really meet each other's needs, build relationships in a time of social distancing and quarantine, all virtually over the phone. And it's been so amazing just in my own neighborhood, because I know more folks in a pandemic than I knew before the pandemic in my neighborhood. When I go on a walk, I see people I know. At the same time, I'm able to, drop off supplies for folks that don't have transportation or are older and shouldn't be exposing themselves to, going to the grocery store and things like that. And it's really a grassroots movement. It's not an organization, doesn't have its own funding structure. So it's quite amazing, and they're all over. And so I highly recommend looking into that as well online. There's so many different articles. So because of that, we actually have a really close relationship with Reverend Burton, who's at New Northside Missionary Baptist Church. He is the senior pastor there. And he's also a leader in environmental justice work in the region as well. We started having conversations about how we've been plugging in with mutual aid in our own neighborhoods and recognize the need, obviously, in Jennings in the 27th Ward area, where it's the majority Black community residents with little to no resources, even grocery stores, and the nearest clinic is miles away. And so we just recognized that we wanted to plug in somehow and fill the gap of need that wasn't being met by these larger food distribution drive-throughs for folks who, like I said, don't have transportation, shouldn't be exposing themselves. And so we've been able to do ministry in the midst of a pandemic by making phone calls to folks, checking in on them, asking what their immediate needs are. We got a small grant, and it's been a beautiful thing. And the folks that we've impacted, we continue to build a relationship with them. And we've got about 10 folks who've asked for spiritual support. And so now we've been able to loop them back into and bring them into the fold of the congregation.
Yeah, that's been one of the most courageous pieces of the work, right? But also the work has actually accelerated, if you will, especially in this space, because like many things, the policies, the planning of these super polluters, if you will, throughout Missouri specifically, did not stop, right? And if anything, it accelerated. And so, yeah, I am so grateful for the partnership with Emmaline and all the hard work that we are able and capable of doing with the Reverend Burton and all the congregations over there. Like that was definitely one that helped meet an immediate need, right? And, for organizers and just for community people alone, when you see and you know something's wrong, it's our human nature to want to fix it, right? But there was a time when we were like, what do we do, right? What do we do? And so mutual aid, if folks haven't plugged in yet, please do. What is it? It's mutual aid STL. And
STLmutualaid.org.
There you go. Shameless plug, but like if you want to donate, you can donate directly to an individual, or even just for the food, just for us to collect the food. We have many partnerships with farmers who are also just looking to answer the call to get resources out, to healthy food out to communities. I mean, the relationships that was able to be built across the city, across the state, is one that you dream about, to try to say, like, this is why I do what I do. And so it was a lot of work, but yes, it gave all the feels, but also it allowed us to share the information on people's rights that were getting infringed upon during this time of the pandemic. The pandemic definitely was an eye opener. It definitely allowed us the opportunity to hone in and be like, this is not an accident. Why they were able to first put the first clinic to help get people tested in the county and not in the area where people were having the most numbers, right? Like if 1 + 1 is 2, then where are you going? You know what I mean? So, and it caused for people just to wake up and be more vigilant and aware about what's really happening behind closed doors. And so for that, it's a blessing and a curse, right? But I'm hopeful. I'm more hopeful than ever about what community actually looks like when we come together. So
I also want to add that, it also helped us to understand that we weren't just meeting these immediate needs, that this work was inherently tied into environmental injustices, because the areas we were working in and we were, trying to fill the need and the gaps for need were also the areas that have the least resources, like you're saying, for healthcare, for COVID testing. For months, there was only one testing site in North County, and so we also partnered with, the mayor of Jennings and also Alderwoman Boyd in the 27th Ward to actually and other congregations to distribute PPE masks, because they weren't in the communities as well. And so it's just clearly understanding that connection of environmental justice and the pandemic and how it is the color of COVID, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, let's just be really clear. Like before COVID, back in 2018, Missouri Equity Indicators Report indicated that the air pollution in Missouri contributes to 110 asthma-related hospitalizations of children in the ER. 86 of those children are self-identified as African American.
And then those conditions are those underlying conditions that make COVID so much worse. So it's one thing on top of another then.
It's one thing on top of another, one thing on top. And then just think, when we're talking about environmental justice, right? If we don't get our air right, and you can't breathe already, right? Then it's Missouri, so we have allergies. So that mixed with that, right? Then if you live in a house that has mold, right? Then do you have healthcare access? Oh no, because the nearest clinic is miles away. Okay, so now you got bills. Oh, but you don't have a car that you can rely on, right? So one thing on top of another, on top of another. What kind of environment are you living in? Right?
And then when you have a flare-up, you go to the ER and the bills that get added on because you're not able to access preventative health care.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then if the list, go that far, and your children who's now home, bedridden, can you go to work? Or who's at home that can go to, or how long can you do that? Right? We're living in the pandemic now. How many people are still furloughed? And yet they want to start turning off people's electricity right now. But children are going back to school online. And which also was another thing that we realized, people don't have access to the internet everywhere. People would say, oh, well, we live in the city, you're fine. No, you're not. Not everybody has the same access in the city. What you have in 63109 and what you have in 116 is two different things.
And let's be clear, even if you're paying for electricity, doesn't mean you have full access like folks in other areas of the city.
And even if you're paying for electricity, doesn't mean that your bill is equal to what it should be. Because I know somebody who's paying $1,000 in electricity bill, but it's no sense. And their apartment is equal to the size of mine, and I'm only paying like $100. That's because I use a lot of air.
Well, and also, internet access isn't just the cable going to the house. There's a big chain there, and so it's well and good if the utility company actually does get around to getting the cable to the house. Then it's about, well, is there the infrastructure inside the house? Is there the modem? Is there the laptop or the tablet that allows the child to be able to participate? So it's not just one thing, but it's a whole chain of things that need to happen.
Yeah. Because that was one of the conversations, one of the women that we work with does a lot within the community over in Dutchtown South. And one of the issues that they're facing is parents without access to computers. And we, as a country, we're in a deficit to getting access to computers because guess who we get our computers from? And yet we have this tariff situation, right? So it's you don't want to be oh, but it's not political. Yeah, but it ends up being, right? Because it's all part of the full picture. We're all in this together, right? And every piece of the puzzle, every tree to every person matters, right? And if one thing of the system is broken, then we all are affected by it. And that's what environmental justice is.
And it sounds like what this has also provided you guys a great opportunity for is to build those community connections for that next step. Now you have connections for when there is that need for an action for something that we more typically think of as an environmental problem. So whether it's getting lead out of homes or mold out of homes, now there's that infrastructure built where there's community and community power that can place that pressure on the powers that be.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And I'd say a big intention of mutual aid networks is not just to respond and react to the pandemic, but to maintain those relationships in that network for the long term, for if there were, to be another pandemic or whatever it might be.
Talk a little bit about listening to the community as opposed to swooping in. That's obviously something that we take pride on and work at in MCU. So talk about the ways that you listen to the community.
It's a part of relational organizing, which is the main way that MCU goes out into communities and builds relationships. It's relational means what it sounds like is having one-on-ones with folks and building long-term relationships. And as you might understand, that can take some time. But it is really grounded in authentic understanding of one another and our self-interest. And it also requires vulnerability from both parties in order to build trust. I think that's the biggest part of it. And so it's many conversations it's that are intentional and like I said, honest and authentic. And then it's also having an analysis and questions around, what's the particular issues that we're talking about? Where does your self-interest lie based on that? And can we create and understand an analysis around how that issue is impacted by local politics, is impacted by people in power, and that you yourself as a resident who's impacted by this does have power, does have a voice to do something about it. And let's talk about the strategies and what we can do to do something about it. And really, it's about mobilizing other folks in your network, friends and family, people that you can have conversations with and line around and educate around these same issues, because it really takes a village to make change, right? And it's you mentioned this in the very beginning of the podcast, where you introduced MCU and a lot of the work that we do around people controlling our government right now, right? And a lot of the powers that be that has not been allowing us to have a true democracy. So it's like, but in order to do that, we need to have people understand and be involved in the political system. And we're at a crossroads now where we've heard the narratives that have taken away that power of voting doesn't mean anything, your vote doesn't count. That's all not true, but it's a narrative that really has impacted a lot of folks and stripped away that power. So how do we bring that back to one another? How do we build relationships and build up that trust that we do have that power? Because we do.
Talk a little bit more about why voting is so important to what you're doing with environmental justice.
Oh, it's tied in completely. I mean, Leah touched on some of these topics earlier about the political process and how a lot of these big polluters like Emmaline and other companies have a lot of money, and they use a lot of that money to be able to lobby at our state capitol around different policies and laws that help and benefit them to do the work that they want to do. But it's all fueled by profit at the end of the day. And so if we don't have more people from the communities that are being impacted the most with their voices, whether it's, through actions or especially through voting, then we don't hear that, we don't see that, and profits are always going to overcome any of that voice if it's not there, right? So that's why voting is so important, because it ties into policies, and policies impact our communities at the ground level.
Leah, we're talking about voting. For you, for Sierra Club, why is voting important and getting out the vote so important?
So, the two governing boards, if you will, that oversee what happens in our environment, in our environment is the DNR, Department of Natural Resources, and the EPA. There's one national and there's a state level. Both of those groups matter, right? And if the local EPA doesn't represent the people accordingly, then we have a problem, right? If the Department of Natural Resources don't represent the values and protect our natural resources, we have a problem, right? So when we vote and let our voices be heard, especially those who live in these areas, especially also those who you live in these areas and you haven't done the census, do it, right? All of this matters, right?
And just to reiterate, we actually have now until October 31st to fill out the census. So fill out your census if you haven't done so.
Right. And I was one of those people, right? To be very clear, I was one of those people who was taught not to don't fill out the census, right? Because, you're Black, so they'll find you, right? That was the clarity, right? Always use other. Now, hindsight 2020, with the education that we now know about, that was also a tactic used, right? Used to keep people out of being counted, right? And, enough of that, right? Because we're being affected in ways that no one would ever have thought would be possible. Our human rights is being infringed upon because we're not accounted for. And so we need to be accounted for in the census. We need to be accounted for at the polls, and really make sure that we have the people that need to be in place, whose values are in line with the progression of all Missourians, right? But specifically in being a part of dismantling the very racist system that has been holding back folks all these years.
And Leah, what does it mean to not be counted?
So I was the field lead, right, for Clean Missouri, where we were able to educate folks all across Missouri around the need for reducing funding, private monies that was used to lobby our leaders in Jefferson City. And so to not be counted for is to have a misrepresentation of your values. To not be counted for allows things like what they're trying to do now is identify what schools are worthy and what schools aren't, and what bus routes need to get the access to, what roads need to get repaired, to even what we've been witnessing, the months and months of murders on Black lives, right? When you're not counted, we are not counted. And that's a problem. And so I'm begging for anyone of color who's going to be out here voting for all other things, let your vote count, but you count as well. And know that when you go to that poll, you're not just voting for your own interest, you're voting for mine too, for all of ours.
And that ties us into, amazingly enough, environmentalism or environmental justice tying into Amendment 3, which is on the ballot coming up in a couple of weeks in Missouri. You want to talk a little bit about the dangers of Amendment 3 and how that will affect an undercount for representation?
So definitely, right? No on 3, right? So say no 3 times, right? And it's because what has happened is they've unfortunately, the legislature, folks in the legislature who's not for democracy reform, they want to keep gerrymandering alive. They want to keep the money where they said. So the Team 4 would be able to stay siphoning resources out of the areas around the central corridor, like Fountain Park. That's a problem, right? It will also reduce the voice. Well, basically get rid of the voices of anybody under the age of 18, and any immigrant, refugee, individuals that live in any area in Missouri. It also doesn't count them either. So basically throws out the census, right? And that's not what our foundation is built on in this country, right? No one literally, other than the indigenous folks who were here, are the only ones who have the right to say that they're from here. The rest of us are immigrants ourselves. The rest of us are refugees ourselves. The rest of us were brought here for other reasons, right? But nevertheless, we are not from these lands. These are not ours, right? And that's a whole nother conversation, right? Nevertheless, all of our voices are supposed to matter. That's what our fundamentals are brought up on, right? And to deny folks of that and say that, you know what, if you don't have a visa, some of us know that it takes a long time to get one of those, right? Or if you're under the age of 18, right, then you don't count, right? So that
you're not worthy.
You're not worthy.
You're not a whole person, right? You don't have the rights of a citizen in this country.
Right. And that's not what our Constitution was built upon, right? And so who is it to take that judgment onto another person in this country, right? In this state, right? And that also, what that does too is, when we talk about lifting up the voices, lifting up the concerns of the most marginalized, we're talking about limiting those voices even more. You're talking about silencing those voices even more. right? You take away those resources, what do you have? Right? You're already in a difficult situation as is, right? And guess what? The pollution doesn't stop, right? It's coming, right? It doesn't just, like, the water doesn't stay in one spot, the air doesn't stay in one spot, and our land is porous. I mean, we are river people. That means we got holes all through our makeup underground, right? And so if we don't start taking account for each other, then it'll find its way to the most affluent parts of us.
I think that's one of the things that I like most about environmental justice over just, say, environmentalism. I feel like environmentalism still carries forth this old idea of humans being separate from nature. Environmental justice seems to say we are part of this environment. All of us are part of this environment. So that means we need to figure out how to live in the environment, and not just it's an either or. Either we take all the resources or we stop all the progress. It seems to be a more holistic movement than either previous incarnation.
That's right. I mean, just like, let's to get to the clarity of the bigger picture here is in the United States. Our utility, our Missouri's number one utility, right, is ranked the fourth largest emitter of sulfur dioxide in the nation. You can't breathe that. and you know, we want to say Midwest values. How does that represent Midwest values, right? And I grew up here, right? And so my values is all about, if I want to go down by the river, I need to be able to get on the river. I need to be able to sit my feet in the river, right? And I need to be able to go camping when I want to. But if I can't breathe, then I'm stuck inside.
Like, we're not even talking about water pollution too, for the folks that do rely on water, you know, drinking water and the water table, and
that's a whole yes, right? And like where the same utility is the 9th largest emitter of mercury and the 14th largest emitter of carbon dioxide and the 14th largest emitter of nitrogen oxide. What is that? The largest is Labadee, is over there in Franklin County, called Labadee, where there's no scrubbers, right? That tries to keep whatever smoke that's being emitted, some of it clean.
Yeah, and you know what you said earlier too, just connecting that, like, every tree, every person counts, and we're all connected. And that's a big part of what you're saying, Kevin, about environmental justice. It's not just about, you know, us versus our environment. It's us within, and how we all impact that, and how even this water pollution that's coming out of the Labadee factory is going into our Mississippi River, along with all of the other pollutants from our industrial farming, and, you know, coming out of the water table and all of that, and just contributing to the Gulf and the dead zones down there. So it's all connected, right?
All connected.
I see the rivers and the tributaries like veins, and we're a living, breathing organism along with our earth.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, even to talk about how we removed, so there was all these trees that were removed from the city, right? They were removed all throughout the city because they were invasive. Good job. I don't know who planted them in the first place. But then we need to replace those trees. Trees alone can help. Trees are good actually for removing toxins out of our ground, right? Trees, we already know it's good for oxygen, right? Trees are also good for helping cool places down, right? Reduce sound pollution, right? It's also known to be nothing more, but the swaying of the trees helps relax people, right? There's science to all of this. Right? We need the trees, and the tree needs us to plant them. You know, so why not? You know, and that's the problem, right? Like, you could go downtown and you can go to Central Corridor and find trees everywhere. It's beautiful. But then you just keep going towards Jefferson and you're wondering, where did everything go? Why is it so dry? It rains like everybody else, but why is it so dry?
Right. So you guys had an opportunity to participate recently in an Air We Breathe conference. Tell us about what that was and what you took away from it.
So the Air We Breathe is a wonderful event that is all based off of the identifying the continuing conversation around environmental injustice, environmental racism, while lifting up the lives that are impacted in a very celebratory way, right? Because out of all the chaos and out of all of the conditions that people are being placed to live in, there's still beauty that exists, and we get to celebrate that beauty while also holding a mirror up to what is affecting these lives, right? Our lives. And so the Air We Breathe is an event that is a part of or related to an event that happens down in both New Orleans and in Texas that is called The Breath is Life. And so there we, at both events, we combined, education around what's happening with food apartheid throughout Missouri, and the housing conversation, as well as the air conversation. Next year, we'll be talking a little bit more about water, and providing opportunity for folks to come together as a community to not just learn about these, but to come up with ideas and solutions on how to address them. And then also intertwine, life and celebration through art, such as poetry, music, dance. We did dance this year, which was awesome. And really highlight some of the works that art and the environment are used to help our children thrive and move forward during these unsteady times.
Okay, great. Thanks. As we start to bring things to a close here, let's talk about any actions that either group have coming up that you want to call people's attention to call people to action and bring them into our activities, and then tell us how we become involved, what's the contact information, and how do folks step up and participate.
I would really highly recommend, as we mentioned, a couple of actions throughout the conversation already, look into stlmutualaid.org to see how you can plug into your community, get involved, if you can offer any type of support, whether it's monetary or if you're able to, deliver supplies, purchase supplies, things like that. There's all different ways to plug in. If you don't want to expose yourself, we need folks making calls. We definitely need translators as well. And outside of that, we also, I always want to lift up, there is an environmental racism report that was published last March. So, and that's specifically for St. Louis. If you want to learn more, please look that up. It is free. It's available online. We can also link it as well.
Yeah, and then on to the other side of that report, we are working on collecting solutions, right? And the solutions, just like the Jemez Principals tells us, we need to get the solutions from the community, right? And so the community is all of us. So there will be listening events where we will be providing some additional background information regarding specific issues. There'll be 4 of them, and then opportunities to be trained, to get some training around your story of self and telling your story, in which if you opt in, you can also get that recorded, and these suggestions and stories, as well as additional collected data, will be compiled into a report and given to legislators all across Missouri. Also, again, vote. Vote, do the research. The Sierra Club has a report card on everybody and everything that is out. You just go to the Sierra Club homepage, the Sierra Club Missouri, and you can find out. We have a report card on everyone and anything, and how it relates to the environment. We also want to invite folks to just reach out to either Emmaline or myself, both at the Sierra Club or at MCU, and really get engaged, how they might feel called to get engaged. There's so many ways to get this work done, And, it's going to take every single one of us and our own individual magic to make it happen. And so I just welcome any and all to the community to like, let's get this done in a just and equitable way so that we have a earth, have a world that we can actually say that we helped put together.
Okay, great. I want to thank our guests today, Emmaline Giles, the Environmental Justice Organizer at MCU, and Leah Clyburn, Beyond Coal Organizer for the Sierra Club Missouri Chapter. To learn more about MCU, go to the Metropolitan Congregations United website at mcustlewis.org. And also be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for news and events. I'm Kevin Prang, and you've been listening to This Is What Democracy Sounds Like. Tune in again next time, and thank you for listening.